What's up? Pleasure to meet you.
Such a pleasure to be here.
It's I heard your story. Why don't you tell everybody your story, because the story is pretty wild.
Yeah, so I grew up in Detroit, working class neighborhood. Dad was in the Air Force and worked for the state. Mom was a homemaker. So on the outside looking in, it really looked like a household where the kids should make it. But unfortunately, it's a very abusive household. And I ran away when I was about 13 years old. And at the time prior to that, honor roll scholarship student, dreams of being a doctor, artist. I wanted to be a doctor because I felt like that was an occupation where I felt like you can help people. And unfortunately, when I ran away, I thought that I would basically just kind of get welcomed into the home with someone who would see this kid and be like, oh, this kid just deserves love or whatever. But I found myself on the east side of Detroit in an apartment with a gun to my head. And it was my introduction to the street culture. I was being robbed. And I was being robbed by this guy who later we would learn his name was Tiny. Even though he was like big, fat, probably about 6 feet tall. And him and his partner, Lily, robbed me at gunpoint, took my drugs, took the money. And I think that was like one of those moments where the innocence of being a kid just was shattered. It's like, now I'm in this world where my life is in danger. But I stayed in that culture. My childhood friend was murdered. I was beat nearly to death. And despite that, I just continued to sell drugs. It's one of the things when I think back to, even that part of my life, there's the glorification of like the hustler, right? It's like, we out here making money, we're doing things, but the reality is it's a kid navigating a very dangerous adult world at the time that crack is just penetrating the community. And one of the things that I always go back to this image of the first time I made a lot of money. And I just had this wad of cash, like it's like all singles, $5 bills, $10 bills. And I went to the store on the corner and I bought all the cereal that I can think of, like all the cereal that I could not. My parents, even though, my dad made decent money, like we couldn't always get all the cereal because it was like all these kids. And then I bought like chocolate milk and strawberry milk. And then I went back to the crack house.
Wow. And you were like, what, 13?
Literally like 13 years old. And so, I stayed in that culture. And then when I was like 17 years old, I was standing March 8th. I'll never forget that day. I was standing on the corner and I got into like a minor conflict. And then I got shot multiple times. And that was probably the most serious turning point in my life. After I got shot, they called ambulance, and the ambulance never came. At this time, I'm on the west side of Detroit. And I'm just sitting on the porch bleeding. And my friend, he was like, look, I'm going to have to take you to the hospital because the ambulance is just not going to come. And I remember getting in the car, and he's just like, breathe, like you got to take these deep breaths. This is how you're going to navigate the pain. And the reason he was able to do that, he had got shot the year prior, so it's just like he got shot, his friend got killed. So the gun violence was just, it was so much a part of like the culture and that I grew up in that I didn't think about what was happening inside of me after I got shot. And so I get to the hospital. They take 2 of the bullets out of my leg, and they leave 1 bullet in. And basically, they patch me up. And, I remember my dad coming to the hospital, and at this point, I was the third of my brothers to be shot. And I'll never forget this look on my dad's face of like, it was almost a look of like defeat, of like, how do I save my boys, And so when I left the hospital, like nobody, like the doctor, the nurse, nobody just was like, hey, you're going to have all these feelings. And so I get back and I'm in the neighborhood and, I'm angry because I really want to get revenge on this guy who shot me. Like that's the number one priority for me is like, I got to retaliate. And then I'm standing outside. This is probably like day 2. I had crutches, so I'm like literally in the neighborhood, crutches, patched up bullet wounds. I'm standing on the corner, and I remember a car coming down the street. And like my body almost seized up, and I was like, why am I feeling this kind of like anxiety? Now it's anxiety. Back then, there was no name for it. But I couldn't tell my friends that I really was afraid of standing outside and being exposed.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that was 17 years old. And so what happened after that was I began to tell myself this story that if I found myself in conflict again, I would shoot first. And I began to literally carry a gun every day. It wasn't the first time I had carried a gun, but like I began to carry a gun like every day. Like it didn't matter what I was doing. Using the bathroom, gun is on the sink. Going to sleep at night, gun is up under the pillow. Probably wasn't the smartest place to sleep with a gun, but that was the nature of how I felt, what I was dealing with. And so I started to tell myself this narrative. And about 16 months or so later, maybe 14 months, I was DJing a party, and I love music. I come from Detroit. It's one of the greatest music cities, in the world. And so I'm DJing this party, and shots ring out. People are running, scrambling, getting away, and the people whose party I was DJing, they come to the back. They're like, somebody got shot in the front, so we got to shut everything down. So we shut the party down. We're on like super heightened alert. We're making sure we got head count for like our crew. And, it's me and my girlfriend, and we're going back to my home. And I remember us walking, we had walked around to the party. We were walking back, and this truck pulls up. And it's, it's a car full of guys. And so, I'm on edge. I got a pistol on me. So I'm like, what's happening? And he was like, oh, no, we just, did y'all know that Derek was the guy who shot the guy in front of the house? So now we got at least some idea of what the shooting was. So we get back around. And when we get on our block, cars coming up the street, and there's a guy inside the car. And he's like, yo, he calls me over. And I'm like, what's happening? He's like, yo, I want to make a deal, blah, blah. And he got two guys that I don't know. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do the deal right now. Like, it's a lot going on. And, so I'm a little amped up, it's a lot going on. And so we get into this verbal altercation where he's like adamant about me selling some drugs to him. I'm adamant about him, like, getting off the block. And so that escalates into like a full blown argument. And one of the guys in the car with him, he joins into the argument. So we're like all back and forth, back and forth. And there's a moment where, I turned to, I turned to walk away. And I like literally took what, probably like one or two steps. And I thought I heard one of them trying to get out of the car, and I turned and fired 4 shots that tragically ended the man's life. It's one of those moments that I always think about that moment. Like, what if I'd have just took like a second step? What if I would have just like, it was a series of what ifs, but when I tragically ended this man's life, and it wasn't the first time I had been in a gun battle. It wasn't the first time I had been in any of that lifestyle. I felt it. I felt like I did something that was like, you can't undo. Like I felt it in my spirit. Like at 19 years old, I'm like 1 month into being 19, and I was just like, I fucked up. Like I've done something that's not. You can't repair that. You can't come back and say I'm sorry. You can't come back and be like, I made a mistake or whatever. And so, the car screeches off. People are, running inside the house. Everybody's just like, what is happening? I made everybody leave, and then I was like, I got to go on a run or something. Like I don't want to get arrested. I don't want to be accountable. But I was arrested probably a day or so later. I was charged with open murder, and I was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison.